Dr. J. Bhattacharya, thank you for welcoming us in your home, I presume, and thank you for accepting the invitation of the Weird Sauce podcast. Could you kindly introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. So I'm Jay Bhattacharya. I'm a professor in the medical school at Stanford University in the Department of Health Policy. A long time in the Department of Medicine. I've been working on infectious disease epidemiology for most of my adult professional career, as well as a whole bunch of other topics. My training is I have an MD and a PhD in economics. I'm a research scientist. I've been very active in COVID. I'm the co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, which argued against the COVID lockdowns.
So, if I was being facetious, I would say what brings you here, but actually, I think the audience knows, we all know. So, this is now summer 2023. And we are, it's fair to say, 3+ year into the largest, at least in my lifetime. Maybe you had different experience, but we're roughly the same background. But the largest pandemic and the largest health event, I think, at the scale of the planet that we've all gone through. So, give us a very high level sort of sequence of how the calendar worked for you, how you sort. We know how you got involved, but generally speaking, what was the calendar from sort of late 2019 to where we are now? And then we can focus on some of the key things like the trial that you have against the Biden administration, perhaps the censorship industrial complex, and then we'll start looking at what is your perspective in terms of how the world responded to that versus what America did, because you're very familiar with how America did and perhaps what the UK did. So, generally speaking, let's start with that.
Sure. I think broadly speaking, from an epidemiological point of view, the big difference between, let's say, January, February, March 2020 and today is that nearly everybody on Earth has had COVID and recovered, or has had the vaccine, or both, but most likely both. But that means then is that COVID, it's here to stay. It's not. It's never going away. We have no technology of getting rid of it. It is going to spread. It's now the fifth circulating coronavirus in human populations. It's just a fact of life. It's something we have to accept. But because the population is so much more immune than it was in March of 2020, it's a very different disease than it was in March of 2020. People can get it, and the likelihood of dying from a single infection is much, much lower thanks to that immunity. Um, the disease spreads. It's I think if you it, the fact that you get pretty good immunity after you recovered, that's pretty now well established. We know so much more about the disease than we did back in March 2020. So the panic around the disease is much less. So I think broadly speaking, that's the arc. That's where we are now. That's what's so different about now is that when we don't we are at a better position to manage the disease, but we have to come to there's still many people that have not come to terms with the fact that the disease is here to stay.
And so you mentioned in introduction the Great Barrington Declaration. So I remember hearing about this very early on while I was in Singapore in lockdown and thinking, okay, so let's have a look at what that is, because the way that it was presented, I think the first time I heard of it, given the international context, was on a show called Unheard, where you showed up, and I think there was your colleague from Cambridge University, and they did the covering of that. And they were at that time they've evolved a little bit then now, but at that time they were still quite dubiously presenting this, as in very cautiously, maybe not dubiously, but cautiously presenting it. And I remember thinking, okay, well, let's read it. And when I read it, I thought, well, being myself a research scientist, I thought, well, that makes perfect sense. This is what we are supposed to be doing. And having lived in Asia for a long time while SARS-1 was on, that's exactly what we did. And I couldn't just understand what was the huge backlash, and mostly political and value based, as opposed to essentially public health and science, and that was going on. And I remember thinking that it immediately felt like it was now a political move where all the people involved and all the suggestion involved were strictly public health, common sense that had been in the plan for a long time. So what led you to try to get something like this going? Um, knowing the experience that you were having in California at the time?
Well, I mean, if you look back, this was October of 2020 when we wrote the declaration. Locally, where I live in California, my kids had been out of school all that spring, and they were still out of school in the fall. It was really clear there seemed to be no end to the school closures in places like California. But looking around the world, there were reports coming out about catastrophic harms from the lockdown to the poor, to the vulnerable people of the world. I think the UN World Food Program estimated in April or May 2020 that 130 million people were going to be thrown into dire food insecurity. Already were dire food insecurity as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by the lockdowns. 100 million people thrown into $2 a day or less of poverty worldwide. The lockdowns were causing devastating harm. And at the same time, we knew that it was really vulnerable older people, that it was really older people that are primarily vulnerable. I mean, younger people could get the disease and could actually die from it, but at much, much lower rates than the older population. Um, and so you put these two facts together, you get the Great Barrington Declaration: protect vulnerable older populations, lift lockdowns. That's the basic idea based on those two scientific facts that I think basically everyone agreed on. Um, the controversy of it was, I mean, in some ways it was predictable. Like a lot of the people that pushed the lockdowns in the spring of 2020, they pushed those lockdowns despite the century of experience with respiratory virus pandemics that essentially managed it with something like the Great Barrington Declaration. And if you actually look back in March of 2020, you have people who were very prominent advocates for the lockdown in March of 2020 advocating against the lockdowns in places like the Washington Post. They're saying, you may well just be the Great Barrington Declaration. We were just restating the old pandemic plan, the thing that had worked, or the plan that had worked for a century of respiratory virus pandemics. Um, and I think if you want to, I mean, we can talk about like what the why there was such a pushback, but I think a primary reason is hubris. A lot of the people that have recommended lockdown, people like Tony Fauci in March of 2020, the architects of the lockdown, their entire reputation was on the line over the efficacy and necessity of the lockdown. If you have prominent scientists from Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford saying, "Oh no, we don't need the lockdown. There's this other alternative strategy available that will protect life better and also not cause harm to the poor, to children, and working class," that's either if you have a lot of if you believe that you are the science itself, that like Tony Fauci said, you will respond to that in a very negative way. Rather than trying to change your course, you will respond to that by trying to destroy and smear the reputations of the people that are contradicting you. You'll employ propaganda tactics and the politics of destruction using media sources to attack that rather than engage with it. And that's unfortunately exactly what happened.
But I mean, that's a very generously candid qualification of government motives. Now, I agree with you that probably hubris is certainly part of the equation. However, when we go back to the origin of this virus, there's a whole catastrophic pyramid of responsibility that involves, surprisingly, the same folks. So then, if we go one sort of scale on reverse engineer back, then we sort of then ask the question as, okay, so how far back into the origin of gain of function, and that's where all the hearings that I've listened to, again from a distance, with various senator and Congress, regarding COVID origin. It's evident that for a long time the origin of the virus was denied its true, sort of DNA, so to speak, considering the relationship between NIAID and the Institute of Virology in China, and Predict Grant and Diffuse and EcoHealth Alliance. So they, at the time when they were talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, or they were talking about lockdown, they obviously knew that they had been involved in these for decades. So then it puts the whole denial and explanation into a completely different, dark and much more sinister angle. What is the after having done all the unfolding that you've done, and especially considering that you were not just discredited, you were maligned, your professional standing was attacked. You were, after we discovered the Elon Musk file, Twitter file, I believe you were involved in that. Maybe you can talk more about this. You obviously discovered that it was not just an accidental deplatforming or whatever, that there was actually a whole infrastructure of the, I think the term is the censorship, industrial complex. Um, has this not sort of made you rethink the whole decision making process on how to, the narrative of the lockdown and the fumbling, and I know lots of big egos were involved, and therefore this is why we made all this quote unquote decision. Not have you not rethink about this with the sense that wait a minute, this is very, very sinister, and it is very long standing, and it involves DARPA, and it involves, so what's your view on this now in the summer of 2023?
Yeah. So, like, yeah, let's fast forward to now. I agree with you that entirely that it seems very likely that this was a lab leak, that this was there was something about this virus that was not just purely a virus that's in the wild that happened to jump into human populations. This was the result of a deliberate set of research activities done, funded by the United States, conducted in China and elsewhere. So I think let's take that as a given. I don't know that for 100% certain, but I very highly suspect that that's likely true. Let's take that as a given. And you're also right. I completely agree with you that it's the same people who pushed the lockdowns that also were big proponents of this research agenda. Um, okay, so now I'm going to try to give the most, the most like uh, so the most sympathetic interpretation, right? And one could go further, but I want to try to give the most sympathetic interpretation just so we have some parameters that we can talk about this. Imagine so first, why would you support a research agenda to make viruses more lethal or more transmissible among humans? The argument, I think, was that you could predict the next pandemic before it happened. You go out in the wild and you find these viruses, you bring them into labs and see how many mutations you need that they need before they can infect humans. And then you could, before the virus even spreads, you could develop vaccines and other countermeasures so that if it does become a pandemic, you have something to do about it. I think both, I think that's exactly the motivation for these people before the pandemic. Now, put yourself in the shoes of someone like Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health, or Tony Fauci, big supporter of this, or Jeremy Farrar and the Wellcome Trust in the UK, big supporter of this agenda. All of a sudden, this new virus emerges in China, and you very strongly suspect that it might have something to do with research that you supported. Your reputation in history, you're going to go down as among history's world's worst monsters, people who caused a pandemic that killed millions of people. You know that for,
That's right. Yep.
and so what do? You're like, okay, I need to close Pandora's box somehow. And SARS one, short local lockdowns made it go away in China. That was what people thought. Although it actually did pop up again in Toronto and elsewhere, so it's not clear that the lockdowns were what made SARS one go away is it wasn't very transmissible on humans. But anyways, that you're thinking that the short local lockdowns made it work. China then tells you that they locked down in January 2020, made the disease go away. You face now both a political problem and a huge opportunity, right? You have this opportunity to erase the fact that you would cause this thing that's likely to cause an enormous loss of suffering in human life, this virus that you would get blamed for, and you have this opportunity of the way out just by this lockdown. And you have a political problem, though. How do you convince the free peoples of the world to adopt authoritarian measures that are necessary to create the lockdown? That's the problem they face. That's I think explains their decision making. That they were trying to close Pandora's box and try to address and mitigate the damage from the harm that they themselves, their support for gain of function work had caused.
Okay. So But then if we think about, okay, so they advocate for something which they obviously know is not going to work on a scientific level, because they probably also have intel that the thing was out probably way before 2020 anyway. Because I know that when we came back in Singapore early 2020, January, that in December when we were in Europe, there was already cases in Europe that were very similar to what at the time we didn't know, but like things like COVID toe, COVID eyes, stuff that actually emerged from the first strain of the Wuhan strain from COVID, which were already circulating in some people who had traveled to China, coming back to Europe. So they must have known this if they knew anything about intelligence, and I'm sure they had intelligence briefing. So they know that the thing is already out. It's probably already, given how contagious it is, it's probably already going to be a worldwide endemic thing. They also know masks are laughable as a construct for a respiratory illness of this size. Um, so they advocate. So first, Fauci comes out to the world and says masks don't work, don't use it, and then he comes and says, "Oh no, I've lied. Actually, masks work, but I've lied for it's a noble lie because we didn't have enough or whatever excuses he brought up." So that you don't get to this level by air. You get to this level by voluntarily misleading people. So that's number one. Number two, you then advocate for something like lockdown, which again it's a second level similarity. You know that's also not going to work, and it's probably going to create countless side effects that are immense. You still advocate for that. And then the third thing is you then advocate for a mandate of vaccines. And the vaccines are conspicuously, again, related to some sort of endeavor that you are linked to. So that's three things. That's a lot for even a Vegas liking person. That's a lot of statistical chance that end up in the hands of the same handful of people. So I'm very uneasy with this. I am very uneasy with this. I wonder what you think about that.
Oh, that's a lot, and I have to say, it's hard. I by nature, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I try to take them like try to think of some good faith interpretation. And it's difficult, I think, in this case. Let's go through the data points you have, just so we can talk them one by one. So one, the disease was already out in December 2019. That is actually, I think, incontrovertibly true. You had outbreaks in Iran. You had outbreaks like in January in January February 2020. You already had that. But there's also evidence that's come out of antibody studies from stored blood banks in Italy and Angola from fall of 2019, September 2019. The disease was already outside of China by 29, like late by August, by September, October 2019. There's free plane travel from China and out. So, and I think that people suspected this but didn't know it for certain. Like if you read the World Health Organization's report from February 2020, they were trying to take China at their word. Oh, we've contained the disease, albeit at great cost, is how they with the Tony Fauci's aide talked about this. So I think they were like in this like state of denial, like the decision makers, like, okay, we're still in a place where we can contain it. We're still in a place we can contain it. Because if it weren't, then they had to tell the world, look, we've supported this research that's going to cause this deadly pandemic, and there's nothing we can do. That was the truth, but that they didn't want to tell the world the truth. Okay, so now it's March 2020. You know, if you're Tony Fauci, that there's been a dozen randomized studies in the past on masks and the flu, and it showed no evidence. There's TV clips of you telling people that don't wear masks during flu epidemics. So you're like, okay, this is not going to work, but you've caused a global panic in addition to the global pandemic that you might have caused. There's huge numbers of people now freaking out. They're storing, you know, they're in the United States. They went to the grocery store to buy toilet paper and stock it up because they're afraid of like shortage of stock. People were panicking, and The panic itself, I'm sure Tony Fauci knew, is itself causes all kinds of harm. So he's like, so maybe you say, okay, well, I'm going to give people this mechanism by which they can feel like they're controlling the risk they face personally. You wear the mask. What does it matter? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least they'll feel like they'll reduce the panic. I think that was maybe motivated. Again, I'm now putting thoughts into his brain and trying to get the best interpretation possible. Because otherwise, I agree with you. He lied. I mean, he lied. Actually, I think he lied twice. He lied about the mask literature in February when he said that when he said that he was lying in March about the mask literature. That itself was a lie. He initially told the truth, the masks don't work, and then later he lied about telling the truth. It's just, so, and again, now your reputation is in mask work, and you have this tremendous power over the funding of other scientists who won't disagree with you because they're afraid of losing their career, right? So, I mean, I think the mask thing is it's shocking, and for I think a lot of people in watching that, their faith in public health just got crushed over that. If they knew anything about the mask literature before. Uh,
That's for sure crushed mine. And then the idea that you can, with the reputation and the standing that you have, you then don't say, oh, by the way, you should casually say, oh, I lied. And as if it has no consequence. It's not like your local or your teenage daughter or sons to say, oh, yeah, I took the cookie and I lied, sorry. Right? Okay, well, they're teenagers and it's in your family. You get that. But this is somebody who went on the world and said, and the rest of the world, so at least the Western world and Asia being into that, just took that all, like, lockdown barrel and basically applied it. And then he casually said, oh no, here is a noble lie in health, in public health, a noble lie. There's no such
there's
thing.
no such thing.
Don't qualify it. It's just a lie. So, as Brett Weinstein said, zero is a very special number. And he got zero right out of all of these things. And it's hard to get to also what really bugs me in this is the opposite of the right thing is not an error. You can't get to like the lockdown is not something that you get out of some flawed thinking. It's such a leap of, what do you mean you're going to lock down the world? You're going to shut business down. You're going to shut schools down. You're going to shut the entire airline industry. It sounded like something straight out of a Netflix show. And yet they did that. And it's very hard to believe that you get to this by hubris or by the inverse of good thinking. So
Okay,
I'm
so
bothered. I'm very bothered by that because these are not idiots.
yeah,
These are not.
these are very smart people. So so that World Health Organization report. So in February of 2020, there's a delegation that the World Health Organization sends to China. It includes this guy Cliff Lane, who was Tony Fauci's deputy. And in that delegation to come back, there's an email from Cliff Lane to the chief epidemiologist at the World Health Organization, Maria Van Kerkhove. The report essentially takes China's position that the lockdown worked, that the January 2020 lockdown worked, as fact. And the only question really is, how do you convince the rest of the world to adopt that approach? So, like, I look at that and I say one of two things. Like, one possibility is that they actually believed it. They actually believed that the Chinese approach worked, that they were duped by the Chinese government and like state epidemiologists into thinking that the lockdowns actually succeeded in reducing the disease spread to zero. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they wanted to they want like if they came out with a report that said that the lockdowns didn't work, then they're contradicting the Chinese authorities. The Chinese authorities then no longer cooperate about investigations into the origin of the virus. They essentially disconnect themselves from the world community, and so then the World Health Organization loses leverage over China. That's another possibility. Both could be true, by the way. So I think the lockdowns are extraordinary. And then you hear Tony Fauci later, essentially, when he's asked about the harm caused by the lockdowns to the poor of the world, he says it's not my business. I'm just a simple, whatever, immunologist or virologist or whatever. I'm not a, I don't study the economic consequences of, or the harm from the economic consequences. That's for other people to say. But at the time, they moralized that if you were against the lockdowns, you were against saving life. There was like some weird trade-off in people's mind about money versus lives. That was the trade-off that they said. But that itself was a lie. It was always one set of lives versus another set of lives, right? If the lockdown works, you're saving one group of people from one disease at the cost of starving 100 million people, right? That was the trade-off. Um, Ironically, and maybe not so ironically, given what we knew about lockdowns from before, the lockdowns were never effective in saving human life in the first place. It didn't actually protect people from getting COVID, right? So it was all for naught. You just starved people for nothing, right? But at the time, it was the inverted moral calculus, pushed by people like Tony Fauci, saying, "Look, if you don't listen to me, you're going to end up killing people." And so it was a sick thing, and I don't really it's really hard for me to process, Florence, how to think about evil like this, because I don't know have another word for it. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt because it's the best way I know to try to understand, like, what would I do were I in that situation? Would I have made the same decision? I mean, we're all, or I believe we're all sinful. We're all capable of evil. Like Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, the line between good and evil cuts through every human heart, right? So we have to. I try to look at it this way simply for that reason, but it's really tough to understand. I mean, the best I can do is these people, they're a very small group of people, tremendously powerful, and they wanted to, and they probably wanted to minimize the harm from the world to the world that they had already done, but they adopted policies that multiplied that harm, that caused even more harm and destroyed any confidence that the most reasoning people will have in public health.
And so now we're talking about a different thing. So now you mentioned WHO. If I'm not wrong, I think that commission out also Peter Daszak in it, which again raises the, like, how does a man who was involved in EcoHealth Alliance, which is the conduit to, NIH funding into the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and all the predict and diffuse ground that we have now seen through Freedom of Information Act in the world of in the work of the drastic group and so on. So we know that it's not possible statistically, again, that in that commission for WHO into Wuhan, you end up with characters that were right in the middle of the gain of function sort of subject that was working on coronaviruses and so on. So again, there is this idea that now you're into a supranational body, that's WHO. And currently we have to remind people, if they don't know, that Jeremy Farr is now the head of research, head of WHO, having gone through the sort of evolution thing that we've seen him going through this pandemic. So he's not none of these people are extracted from the environment in which they are. I mean, Tony Fauci has sort of retired, quote unquote, but he hasn't been taken out from this or put into any sort of judgment standing. So we've got supranational institution. We've got evidently um, supranational research that were going on between China and America that were not such good friends, diplomatically anyhow. So we know that then it's exited the national level only. And then when we look at the vaccine and the fact that America is sort of at the forehead of both the vaccine themselves, because the laboratory that came out with were essentially American laboratory, even though in France, I'm French, we have Sanofi, we have a lot of groups that normally were known to produce vaccine. None of them produced any conventional vaccine or otherwise. So we end up with candidate vaccines that are pretty much all mRNA or RNA vaccine, which is already very surprising. And they are then mandated not just to the States, but then being sold to the rest of the world. Israel got, Pfizer very early. Singapore bought Pfizer very early. And then yet China and Russia, the two countries who did not get mRNA vaccines, they got conventional vaccines, which, by the way, we also bought in Singapore. So We used the Chinese conventional vaccine, and Russia obviously had the Sputnik vaccine, which I think was an RNA vaccine. No, it was a DNA, a virus, a conventional deactivated virus,
Yeah.
right?
I think so. Because the AstraZeneca also was a different method. It was
Right.
adenovirus vector vaccine.
Right. So we end up with these candidate vaccine that are then mandated and distributed to the rest of the world. And I think the latest number that I saw is 7 billion doses by now. And then you go on again. The same characters go on to this new mantra, which is safe and efficient, safe and effective. And you mandate this for a healthcare worker, for the military, with literally 3 to 4 months data, best case scenario. Um, so again, this concept of so you've done all the stuff that you've done, which was already shown to be fairly poorly maintaining anything. And now you come out with a completely novel platform for a vaccine for a disease that mutates. So again, that's pretty counterintuitive in healthcare. And you're going to say that this new thing that normally takes 5 to 10 years to test, to have pharmacovigilance behind it. You're just going to bypass this, give them complete immunity, and then throw this to the world. And then if not everybody is vaccinated, no one is vaccinated. This is a new term to me because then it's also not stratified by age, by demographic, by a risk profile. The whole thing sounded like it came out from a sort of bad juju book that were transformed into science. So how do you make sense of that? Yet another lip into something that's nonsensical.
Okay, so let's start with Daszak and so that because that was actually it was a separate uh, commission. I think it was called the Lancet Commission that tried to look at the origin of the virus in 2020, and they put on the staff of that these people that were actually working on these gain of function work. Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance. It stinks to high heaven. I mean that stinks to like as if it were a cover up. And in fact, it is a cover up, right? Like how do you essentially say to the fox, here you guard the hen house, and then when the hen house is like rift through, you say, well, you tell the fox, well, can you investigate what happened to the hen house? Um, I don't, I can't. So again, two possibilities. One is that these folks who were essentially in charge of of scientist funding of this kind of work fooled the editors of Lancet and other political organizations into allowing this to happen. That's one possibility. I guess it's possible. The other possibility is that the people who were putting those Lancet Commission together, the editor of Science magazine, who's now sort of on Twitter very famously trying to protect the reputations of people like Tony Fauci on this and other topics. They're friends, and so they're not fooled. They just trust they're involved, right? That's the second possibility. But whatever the motives, what we know for a fact is that there was a cover up of the possibility of a lab leak. And not worse than that, the reputations of the people, the scientists who spoke up, you mentioned Drastic and there's some very brave scientists that spoke up, um, that were pointing out that there actually was quite a bit of evidence in favor of the lab leak, biochemical evidence, evidence from the genome of the virus, as well as other circumstantial evidence and intelligence evidence for a lab leak. Their reputations are under attack. There's many of them are smeared and their professional reputations destroyed because they spoke up against these people like Tony Fauci. Not just spoke up, I would say really contradicted. So I think again, I'm going to try to. I can't. I don't. I want to stick to exactly what I know, which is that they covered things up. That's the fact. I don't want to go too much into motives because I don't really know their motives. Now, the vaccines. You raised it. It means a really powerful way you put it. So I just want to go through a little bit about the history of what happened with the mRNA vaccines. The other types of vaccines, other all around the world, people are actually trying to develop vaccines almost immediately. I personally, this is something I got wrong during the pandemic. In March of 2020, when I looked into the vaccines that were there, I looked and I thought, okay, this normally takes 5 to 10 years of development. We're not going to have this vaccine in time to do anything for this pandemic, I thought, in March 2020. And I was wrong about that. In fact, I mean, I was surprised. I was very, very surprised when I saw how rapidly they were already developed by. Actually, it turns out by January 2020, a vaccine target. So in that sense, maybe the gain of function work did what it was supposed to. It gave a vaccine target early. In fact, a vaccine candidate early. All of the vaccines had very similar ideas. They all went after the spike protein. They just had different technologies for how to go after the spike protein. And so that means that work had been done. So normally years of work to get to that point had already been done by January 2020.
Well, I think there is an interview of Stéphane Bancel, CEO of Moderna, in 2016, explaining how they actually had the IP for an S targeted protein vaccine for coronavirus.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So okay. So you have a vaccine. You have a target on the virus that you know you want to hit. The only question is how do you deliver to cells in your body the antigen so that your body produces antibodies and other immune responses to this target. And the mRNAs are one way. In the UK, they and in the Johnson vaccine in the US, they instead go on this adenovirus platform. Other places, in India, in China, in Russia, they're using this more traditional vaccine technology that doesn't involve RNA or whatever. In any case, they all have this target, and the President Trump approves this like Operation Warp Speed to rapidly do an assessment of this vaccine technology in the U.S. Something that would normally take years and years of regulatory hurdles to overcome. They essentially overcome within days, and they run a large trial in the U.S. and elsewhere. On some of these vaccine technologies, tens of thousands of patients. But they don't ask the question in the trial that you would want answered. Like you would want to know, does this vaccine save my life? That's not the end point that they're looking at. They don't even ask the question. Another question you might be curious about: will this vaccine prevent me from getting infected? No. The question they answer is: does this vaccine stop you from getting symptomatic infection, which is different than all infections? There are lots of asymptomatic infections, for instance, and it's also different than does this vaccine stop you from transmitting the disease to other people? The result comes out in December, and because it's such a short time frame, they can only follow the patients for 2 months. That's the median follow-up time. So in December of 2020, there's the famous randomized trials come out saying 95% protection against symptomatic infection for 2 months. That's what we knew in December of 2020. Now, is that enough to tell 7 billion people, 8 billion people, all the entire population of the earth to get vaccinated? I mean, I looked at that evidence. I thought, no. The answer is no. You don't know that for a fact. I mean, it looked to me like let's say it prevents symptomatic infection, which I believe it did for 2 months. That I believe the randomized trial was right on that. Um, well, the right way to use that, I thought, was to protect vulnerable people who really have a high risk of disease, of dying from the disease. And so I wrote an op-ed in December 2020 advocating using the vaccine for older people. And that's it. Tony Fauci looked at this and he looked at that evidence and thought, okay, I can get rid of the disease altogether with this vaccine based on hope, not based on the data that was out in that trial. And again, let's go back to the Pandora's box model. He can close the Pandora's box that he opened with this magical vaccine that's come out. If only it stops you from getting infected. The only problem is that he has to get this vaccine in the arms of every single human. And so how do you do that? You use every bit of propaganda you can. You oversell the result of the trial. You force vaccine mandates. You push the vaccine even in populations it hasn't been tested on, like young children. You suppress true stories about vaccine injuries. you demonize and destroy the careers of scientists who say or pointing out that there are vaccine injuries. You use all of the entire propaganda machine in service of closing Pandora's box with this vaccine that you're sure finally will solve your problem, which is that people are going to think you're a monster for having supported the research that created the virus. Um, and for governments, it's a godsend, right? Lockdowns are political disaster. No one really wants a lockdown in free countries. Even in totalitarian countries like China, lockdowns are unpopular. Um, and so you have this like godsend technology. You just need to get it in the arms of everybody, and then the disease will stop. It'll go away, go to zero. Even though there's no actual evidence that will actually do that, it'll get rid of this virus altogether. It doesn't actually have that property. And you put the vaccine out, and in fact, what you find is that the virus is still floating around. People with the vaccine are still getting sick. It's just complete disaster. I like this Pandora's box model because it gives a human interpretation to what the why these mistakes were made. That mistake after mistake after mistake, just as you pointed out, Florence, that demands an explanation. How did they get so much wrong? It's because they're trying to do the impossible.
And I think, okay, so now we talked about what I call the positive management, which is all the stuff they decided to actively do, which turned out to be catastrophic, but they still actively done it. Now there's the negative management. So the negative management brings us back to the to censorship, industrial complex, and what happened to you and what happened to some extent the very few. Because if you look at the scale of the folks involved, you look at international scientific publication, the proximal origin, for example, which, by the way, is still not retracted. You look at the entire scientific research apparatus. You look at the Surgeon General of the US. You look at all these doctors in all the prestigious institution, and you look at the amount of people who actually spoke out. It's infinitely small. So the question is, tell us more about what actually was the negative management, because that in itself is a whole other ballgame that makes the two together actually extremely suspicious, because you've got two of them at the same time, the positive and the negative management of something that is planetary.
Yeah. Whew, my goodness, you are asking hard questions. So, like, because it's the question is like, why would the uh, top scientific funders con- use these tactics where they induce governments to smear and destroy the reputations of scientists who spoke up? Well, why would they use these tactics? Right. That's, I think, the fundamental question you're asking. Right. So, I think some history is in order. Right. So, like, I think if you look back at the HIV pandemic, um, the tactics that Tony Fauci used in this pandemic to destroy the careers of and reputations of people who disagree with him, he did the same thing with HIV. Right now, in the context of HIV, there was a controversy brought up by a man named Peter Duesberg, who's a professor at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, a very prominent scientist named Peter Duesberg, who had a hypothesis that the cause of AIDS, which is the long-term symptoms and deadly symptoms that happen after HIV infection, were not caused by HIV, but in fact were caused by something else. That was his theory. I don't believe the theory is true, but that was the theory that a very prominent scientist had. There were other scientists who signed on to that theory as possibly true, including a very famous uh, Nobel Prize winning scientist named Kary Mullis, who's the inventor of the PCR technology that's used to, for instance, diagnose whether you have the COVID virus in you. Um,
Who wasn't a friend of Tony Fauci, for sure.
well, Tony Fauci destroyed their careers. A, no,
Yep.
a Nobel Prize. So it rather than just disagreeing and saying, "Look, here's the evidence that HIV does cause AIDS," which I believe it does. Um, he demolished the career of Peter Duesberg, who never got an NIH grant after putting that theory forward. The mechanisms that they used to do this were essentially to smear the reputations of these scientists, prevent them from access to grants and to place the publications in prominent places and so on, in order to destroy the careers of people like this. people who were just disagreed with them. Now, again, I have to say, I don't think that Duisberg and Mullis were right about their theory, about this theory, but but the use of these kinds of tactics to destroy them were entirely inappropriate. So now let's fast forward to this pandemic, right? The same tactics Tony Fauci and Francis Collins used the same tactics to go after the lab leak opponents, to destroy and smear the careers of people who spoke up against them, right? And to create an idea. In fact, it was even worse. They were like saying that if you thought it was a lab leak, you were a racist. That somehow you were somehow it's more racist to believe that the virus leaked out of a Chinese lab than it is to say that, look, the Chinese eat bat soup and caused the virus because of their cultural habits or something. It made no sense, but it smeared the people who made the lab leak hypothesis as if they were somehow so far outside the bounds that you shouldn't listen to them. Very effective in 2020. They did the same thing to me, right? So when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, 4 days after we wrote it, Francis Collins writes to Tony Fauci saying that calling me, Martin Kulldorff was a co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration from Harvard, and Sunetra Gupta, a co-author of Great Barrington Declaration from Oxford. She called the three of us fringe epidemiologists. And even though we have decades of experience in the field, and then he called for a devastating takedown of the premises. And then what followed was a smear campaign using the popular press to argue to say that I wanted to let the virus rip, when in fact what I was calling for was focused protection of vulnerable people. They use these smear tactics on the prominent people that were speaking up in order to make examples of them so that other prominent people wouldn't also speak up. That explains why so few people apparently spoke up. I got messages from countless people telling me that, thanking me for writing the Great Barrington Declaration, but saying that they couldn't speak up because they were afraid for their careers. So the audience knows, like the power that these scientific funders have over the minds of scientists is tremendous. And it's not the money, really, although the money is important. It's the social prestige that comes from getting an NIH grant, from getting a Wellcome Trust grant. If you don't have those grants, you don't have access to the social ladder of scientists. And so your career essentially is under threat if the top funders or the editor of Science magazine or whatever is going after you. And no scientist in their right mind wants that, Florence. Like, they don't want to be made. It's essentially a form of excommunication. These are the high popes of science, and they can excommunicate in using that power that they had. That's exactly what they did. And then there's also non-scientists who are speaking up. What do you do about them? Like, you don't have control over them, over their their ability to get grants, because they don't get grants. Well, then you have to induce governments to censor them. And we live in an age where there's an easy social credit score. All you have to do is tell social media companies to label something as misinformation. And then all of a sudden, anyone who says it, their social credit score goes down. And governments around the world use that power, especially the United States government uses that power, again, at the behest of people like Tony Fauci, who there's emails of him writing with Mark Zuckerberg, explicitly coordinating to create this kind of infrastructure, this censorship industrial complex, as you called it. And it's, pre-existed the pandemic. I think that the infrastructure pre-existed the pandemic, but it was weaponized during the pandemic. And used at a scale I think was previously never used before, for at least for U.S. domestic speech. The U.S. government then engages throughout the pandemic, but especially starting in 2021 when the vaccine comes out, with this like campaign to smear anyone who disagrees with the policy of the Biden administration about the vaccine, for instance. Was entirely inappropriate. So both scientists stay silent, and the public at large gets a sense that that there are all these like crazy people floating around saying things that aren't true, even though what they're saying often is true, right? The vaccine does not stop you from getting infected. That is a truth. And yet you weren't allowed to say that in public on social media in 2021.
So if we think about this in terms of the scale of it, so we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, as you famously were involved with Elon Musk and Discovery, the extent to which you and other people had been incredibly shadow banned. We now have freedom of information. Release email knowing how much the FBI was involved, not just with the COVID story, but now we also know with the Hunter Biden laptop and so on and so forth. So we actually know that there's an infrastructure there that was revealed partly by COVID. Because some pieces fell off, of the driving car, that the speed that it was driving off, but essentially it was already there and it was probably in action. So that all the infringement of First Amendment, and I believe that you are involved in a lawsuit against the Biden administration for infringement of First Amendment, and maybe you'd like to talk about this a little bit and tell us where it's at right now. But what I'm stunned by is how so this happened in the United States. Okay, so we've got pharmaceutical that are Americans. We have Tony Fauci and IID that's American. We have publications that are Americans, and we have censorship and tech company that are American. But how do you explain that then this is downloaded to most of the Western world, Canada, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, who seems to take exactly what America has done and applies it, including places like non-Western geographically, but applying Western sort of things like Singapore or Israel. How do you explain that then they manage to then get those countries to do exactly the same thing with social media, exactly the same thing pretty much with the mandates, and actually sold them the vaccines and block, it seems, vaccine research in the local area, particularly in the EU. I'm assuming Australia is perfectly capable of, bringing a vaccine, a conventional vaccine as well. So there's that question. And the second question would be, at which point did America or American people, the population now, not wonder, but what's going on in Africa? What's going on in Pakistan? What's going on in Latin America? If this thing is as sold, then all those people are going to drop from the face of the earth. And yet they didn't. And they still don't now. And they're still not as sick. And the excess mortality in those countries is not as bad as it is in all the Western countries. So, how does the international situation get explained if not by massive coercion of other kinds?
Okay, so let me first finish up with the censorship discussion, and then we'll talk about
Yes.
the exporting of bad American policy elsewhere. Um, the just very briefly on censorship, just to end it. I found out I joined Twitter in August of 2021 in order to make a public case against the mandate, a whole bunch of like the lockdowns, the mandates in favor of the Great Barrington Declaration. I found out in December 2022 when Musk bought Twitter that I had been placed on a blacklist when I joined Twitter. The purpose of the blacklist was to limit the visibility of my tweets to the select group of people who followed me, rather than allowing the tweets to be seen by a broader population, as if somehow I was so dangerous I had to be contained. Um, why would the Twitter decide to put me on a blacklist? They make money based on tweets becoming popular, not by suppressing tweets. And I wasn't writing misinformation. I was giving citations to published papers in the peer-reviewed literature. I was saying true things. Um, it turns out, in a lawsuit that I'm a party to, brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices, two states in the U.S., against the Biden administration, it turns out that there actually is a vast censorship industrial complex at the heart of the American government. A dozen federal agencies, we have emails and we have depositions showing a dozen federal agencies directly ordering social media companies, telling them what to censor and who to censor, with backed up with threats that if you don't obey what the American government is telling you to censor, then the American government will regulate you, potentially out of existence, make your life miserable. It is a direct and obvious violation of the American First Amendment. The federal government does not have the right to direct media companies about what to publish and what not to publish. It doesn't have the right to censor or demean or smear individuals as an act of government. What the lawsuit found, the judge in this lawsuit wrote that what this entire effort by the American government was Orwellian. He used the word Orwellian, the single biggest violation of American free speech in American history, or very close to it. I mean, you might argue like the Alien Sedition Act in the early 19th century, whatever. But whatever. But the point, certainly in modern American history, I think the single biggest violation of American free speech rights. Right now, it's sitting in front of a three-judge panel. There's going to be oral arguments over this. The judge in the case ordered the Biden administration not to ever interact again with social media in this way, essentially an injunction against that kind of behavior. And so now the Biden administration is trying to fight that so that they will continue to have the right to censor. And we'll see what the federal courts do with this, but it's looking very hopeful at this point. Okay, so now your second point. This is so interesting. Like, how did the American government get so many other governments to go along? Now, I think let's just focus on vaccines, because the lockdowns, I think the World Health Organization played a tremendous role. And I think actually even on the vaccines, the World Health Organization played a tremendous role. But I think, if you look at the contracts that Pfizer had with country after country, they're very, very similar in nature, right? So with Israel, with every country, India actually said no to the Pfizer contract because they wanted to do an independent evaluation. All of those contracts essentially say Pfizer's not held liable for bad things that happen with their vaccines. That guarantees them huge amounts of money per dose, even if the doses aren't delivered into people's arms. It's just a sweetheart deal. When those contracts were written, many of the politicians that signed them essentially signed on to Pfizer. Like they signed on to the success of the vaccine. Billions of dollars of money in every country that signed these contracts, and this is basically every country on Earth, almost every country, certainly every developed country on Earth. The politicians essentially put their entire reputation at stake over this. And it's an American company. The Pfizer. It's an American product. The American policy. I think that's how the developed countries, I think, went along, right? So if you don't succeed with the vaccines, then the politician's reputation is destroyed. So yeah, we'll sign on to this censorship industrial complex. Poor countries are a slightly different story, I think. In poor countries, the World Health Organization were trying to get rich countries to donate the vaccines, but they also the World Health Organization can place tremendous pressure on the politicians in poor countries to go along with it, with what they say. And the epidemiologists that work in these poor countries that were advising the politicians, many of them are essentially in thrall to Tony Fauci, right? I've talked with Indian epidemiologists, for instance. I mean, it's very difficult to contradict Western, like people who are seen at the top of Western, Western science in the minds of epidemiologists and other scientists, scientific advisors elsewhere, because it's so much easier just to say, well, look, the top scientists in the world in the United States and in Europe are saying lockdown. And then you do it, rather than saying, oh, we shouldn't lock down because we see in our local conditions that locking down will starve our population. That's much harder, it turns out, in poor countries. It's actually what it points to is that we need to develop the scientific infrastructure of the world so that so that it is independent of both American and Western influence. And there needs to be a counter to this. The Asia, I think, is a special case. I mean, I think Asia, like Singapore, Taiwan, and others, adopted their own strategies, slightly different than the straight up lockdown folks strategy, but also very much focused on surveillance, contact tracing, quarantining. And I think those strategies were, like, you could look through all through East Asia, and those are all a common set of strategies adopted. I think governments often copy each other because it's easier when there is uncertainty to copy the strategy of someone else and say, well, look, we're not taking any risk. We're just doing what everyone else is doing. And so you don't stick out. the countries that didn't follow these strategies, that didn't copy Sweden, Florida, and the United States, the politicians there faced, at least the people,
Tremendous pressure.
they did.
Tremendous pressure. I mean, Sweden was a very interesting case for Europe, how much they were basically battered through reputation as a country for saying, "Oh, you're going to kill everybody in your population. How dare you?" To quote somebody else. But it was just it's a ridiculous sort of shake the monkey strategy, which again, to me, leaves a very bad taste because it's almost again an indication that something is amiss. Because if we were in a deadly pandemic, people understood this as they would have in any other very high risk thing. You wouldn't have had to enforce police officer or telling people that if you drink standing it's better than sitting or whatever nonsense we had. In France we had people basically having to fill up self attestation to be able to go outside. We had street that had COVID and street that were free of COVID. I mean, the list of nonsensical, delirious things, not to mention videos that were made by healthcare worker dancing and so on. There's so many red flags, and yet those added up to not much at all, to a general revolt within the population to say enough. If you're forcing this, there's evidently something else that's going on. So at the scale of the world, I think we're not done with this because WHO is still around. The funding of WHO is still very questionable in terms of checks and balances. If it's an institution that is supranational, then what rights do each single countries have in managing their own public health risks if we're part of this new deal that WHO is proposing? And then the second thing is, since we're not addressing at the international level the ills that came out from the US, because as much as in the US, obviously you're very much involved in what's going on right now. There's a lot of contention and trials and so on that are on the way. But the rest of the world is very much covering that. Like, I'd be very honest with you, in Singapore and in France, a lot of people have no clue that the scale of the stuff that's going on right now with Ron Paul and folks like you, even the likes of Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, even the Twitter files, which are an evident thing for America, are very seldom talked about. So there's an aura in Singapore, for example, that everything is well. The vaccine is well. There's no issue. Everything was well. We did this best case scenario. Yeah, some mistake here and there. But on the whole, there's still about 20% of the population that's wearing masks right now,
Yeah.
as we speak. So this has not been addressed as what went on. Why did national state lose their national sovereignty over such critical decision that involves the health of the entire population, not just the current health, but the future health? We vaccinated pregnant women. We vaccinated children. And even if the risk was 1%, they actually literally took 1% of the population and they threw them under the bus for whatever risk. And the risk we know was fairly small because mortality of COVID was very small. So considering that we haven't sorted any of these things, we haven't sorted the sort of communicating door between big pharma, government. We haven't sorted out the conflict of interest between large institution like NIID, their funding, and even extra territorial research like gain of function. Gain of function research is not stopped. Big pharma right now has racked, certainly Pfizer, Moderna, over $100 billion out of these shots. And I'm hearing that CDC is saying that there will be sort of a advisory COVID shot every year now in the schedule, the children's schedule and the general population schedule, like flu. So it seems there's absolutely the ball still running and gaining momentum, even though we're all counting as we outside the world, the rest of the world is counting on you guys to make it stop. And it is unfair because I mean it's such a huge problem, right? So how in your view do you think the problem gets solved, or at least we start over? Because it seems to me like we're in the dumpster fire, and starting anything positive from this sounds to me almost impossible unless we burn it down.
Yeah. So I think first of all, let me start with my current pessimistic view, which actually coincides with yours. I think on this, I think that we are in a position where the people that were the primary advisors and architects of this have convinced the world that while they, like you say, like some mistakes were made, they largely, it was inevitable and unavoidable that we had to do the things we did, and they have cemented in place lockdowns as the way we will deal with future respiratory virus pandemics. The next time there's a respiratory virus pandemic, it will happen. We will lock down again, guaranteed. That is now the template for future management of pandemics. As you say, we are still supporting gain of function work. We have not repudiated that, and the World Health Organization is negotiating a treaty to increase its power over the sovereignty of nations in the context of any future pandemic. Because what their view is that the problem was that we didn't all lock down together. That there were some recalcitrant governments that said no, or didn't have the, they just didn't have the power to enact its will, and the future treaties will fix that problem. So we're going down exactly the wrong path. Lockdowns are currently the way now. And now there are a few governments that are trying to do evaluations. I think the UK has a COVID inquiry. A few other governments, like the Norwegian government, has done one. So there are governments that are starting to look, but many of them are asking the wrong questions. Again, why didn't we lock down earlier? Well, when did we know about this? Well, suppose every country on Earth had locked down in January 2020. The disease was already spread out. As we talked earlier in the podcast, it was already, the origin of the virus is probably September 2019. It wouldn't have made any difference. So I don't. Unfortunately, I don't. I think the path we're going down now is a very negative one. It's cemented in place this disaster strategy. I think now there are I think there are some governments that are trying to look at I think I have some hope for the UK parliamentary inquiry. There's in Florida and some other state governments they're looking at this. The Scandinavian countries have done some honest COVID commissions. There was just a report released by the Scottish Parliament, which was very critical of lockdown. So it's not. I don't think it's all bad news, but there's mostly, I think, bad news at this point. I wrote a document called the Norfolk Group document. It's a blueprint for what an honest COVID commission would look like, with just 80 pages of questions anyone asking, did we do the right thing, would seek to answer questions like, what were the harms of the lockdowns? Were those considered before we adopted? Things like that. Okay, so I think we're in a bad place right now. What could happen? If you'd asked me 3.5 years ago, imagine, Jay, a situation like this, what should be done? I would have naively told you, well, scientists can fix this just by asking honest scientific questions. There's still some parts of me that think that way, but I have to tell you, I've now been very disillusioned over the last 3.5 years, and at this point, I don't see any response other than a concerted political action to bring in place and to power people who will repudiate this censorship industrial complex, this lockdown focused measures, this gain of function, this entire infrastructure of power that produced the disastrous pandemic response needs to be repudiated, and it needs to come politically. And I think it's a powerful political platform everywhere where there's a democratic government, right? It's because what you're saying is, look, we need to put back in the hands of the people the power over their own health. It shouldn't be in the hands of a small group of people that have a history of lying to you, where they themselves admit they've lied to you, noble lies, that have a history of making catastrophically incorrect decisions in a self-interested way. Instead, let's put it in the hands of people who let's decentralize these decisions. Let's make these decisions so that no one has the power that Tony Fauci has. No single person has the kind of power Tony Fauci had during the pandemic. I think that would be a very attractive political program everywhere. But it's going to take a new generation of politicians, or maybe existing politicians, who see the opportunity to make it happen. Because right now, that's what it's going to take: a political realignment. and around the world, around focused on this. In the U.S., I see that in the politics of people like RFK Jr. on the Democratic Party side, or Ron DeSantis on the Republican Party side. Um, People who are deeply troubled by the pandemic response and are building campaigns around that, an alternate view of how to manage these kinds of these kind of public health decisions in the future. I'd love to see that kind of movement take place everywhere in the world.
So, to finish on a happy note, I would like to ask you, given what you've done, what in your history and what in your past do you think, now that you've reflected on, have actually sort of prepared you, selected you for the role, the bravery that you've shown, the endurance that you've shown, considering all the cost, I'm sure, to your career, to your family, to time, to probably health through stress, etc. So tell us a little bit more about, what do you think in your past and in your life, your education, your upbringing, how you were raised, brought you to be the man that you are today, and that is so helpful for us.
Oh, thank you for that question. It's a kind question to ask. I I'm an immigrant to the United States. Came to the United States when I was 4 from India. And so my mom was she grew up in a Calcutta slum. I have family in India, still lots of family in India. I've gone to visit, and I've seen firsthand, not in my family now, but in more the broadly, the more the context of poverty in India. I worked in a hospital in India as in medical school. I've seen what poverty can do to people. It's deeply ingrained in how I think about society and about the right sorts of policies. When I first heard about lockdowns, that was my first thought, was to them, was to the people who live in poverty and how much harm it would do. Um, I also in my I have a PhD in economics, as I mentioned at the beginning, as well as an MD. When I applied to medical school, I was thinking about whether I should get a PhD. I always thought about these policy decisions as fundamentally trade-offs, right? That's how economists think about the world. Even but not just policy. All of medicine's a trade-off. Every drug you give does hopefully does more good than harm, but like always has some possibility of harm. You always have to make these decisions in the context of that realization. Um, I applied to medical school in order to marry those two approaches, like the between I mean, I think economics has a lot to say about how we should practice medicine, at least in terms of like a philosophical point of view. And for me, that was my motivation for applying to medical school, was to talk about how thinking, being acutely aware of these trade offs, could make people into better decision makers as doctors in public health and so on. Um, when I saw the pandemic unfold, I couldn't believe that my fellow economists weren't speaking up. That there were other doctors who were trained in this that were speaking up around these mistakes, these, if you want to call them that, that were made. Um, and At some point in 2020, my college, my university had gone after me. It made my life. I mean, although I had tenure there, it made my life miserable. I had to make a decision. Like I said, I had to decide: did I go into this business in order to bolster my reputation, get more publications and fame, or did I go into this business because I actually cared about the poor? Which is what I wrote about in my med school application, about like, the lives of poor people. And I know I couldn't live with myself if I just stayed silent. I just I don't I think it would have made my life much easier, but it would have also in some sense made my life much harder. I had to speak up.
Very well. And so I always ask this question at the end of the podcast to all my guests, and I will ask it to you as well. So, what's your weird sauce? What's your special recipe to be a good contributor to humanity, as you have been?
I think you have to care more about the lives of others than yourself. There really isn't another way. You have to say that, I'm here for a reason, and that reason isn't myself. And if you do that, you're gonna, ironically, you'll live a better life.
Well, that's extremely well said. And as Graham Greene said himself, expectations too are a form of wealth. And I think you are definitely a very high expectation for us all watching your work. And therefore, that gives us hope. And that's a wealth in itself. So thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya, for your time
Thank you.
and for all the effort that you run on behalf of countless unknown people that support you. I wish you all the best, and I wish you good health and good luck in your endeavors of fighting for truth.
Thank you for this conversation. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.